Drinking away your sorrows. Many Americans do so. Usually drinking away your sorrows is a result of depression. But Americans couldn't do that in the height of a depression, the Great Depression. Ah, the piano. Nothing brings people joy than a good ditty on the piano. Or does it? This may surprise you, but when people are depressed, it makes them irritable. On January 11th, 1937, Frank Parker, down on his luck, just lost his job, which used to earn him $15,000 a year. To cope with this, he went to the happiest place on earth. Not Disneyland, no. A bar. There, he started to pour out drinks and his heart into the piano. But another patron of the bar, a Harold Rembert, presumably down on his luck too, told Parker to stop his playing. It made him irritable. When Parker didn't answer to Rembert, Rembert got a gun from another patron of the bar, and he shot Parker dead. Talk about a bad reception to his performance. Cars. The greatest human innovation since the wheel. And sliced bread, of course. The auto industry has had its ups and downs over the years, but what is interesting is the events detailed in the January 11th, 1937 South Bend Tribune newspaper. Published in this newspaper was, of course, a certain article about a Frank Parker and a piano. But other than that, there were two articles of particular note. Sit-downers in Pontiac put out of plant. And blast burns 16 at auto plant. The sit-downers at Pontiac are of note just by the sheer numbers of those who had been laid off because of the strikes and simply wanting better working conditions and pay. It said that nearly 100,000 workers had been laid off because of their strikes. This is not the only atrocity committed by auto plant owners. As said earlier, the January 11th, 1937 South Bend Tribune newspaper had an article on the injury of 16 workers after an auto plant explosion in Newcastle, Indiana. As you may be able to deduce, life as an auto plant worker must have been horrible. Horrible working conditions, and you couldn't change that or risk being fired. Although not all these events, Parker's murder too, the plant explosion, happened in Indiana, Great Depression-era Hoosiers were getting a full whiff of the effects it had around the United States. You must imagine that if you were a Hoosier living in this time, you probably had a grim perspective of the world. But there were nuggets of hope that kept Hoosiers going. During the height of the Great Depression, many Hoosiers were, depressed. In the January 9th, 1933 South Bend Tribune newspaper, one article sticks out the most. This article details the death of John Barron, a man 64 years old when he killed himself. The article details that Mr. Barron had first waded into the St. Joseph River to apparently test the waters. Once he found the waters satisfactory, he promptly proceeded to kill himself. Hoosiers during the Great Depression felt they had no escape. They got desperate, so desperate, they voted a Democrat into the office of governor. In fact, the same day that the Democratic governor, Paul V. McNutt, got sworn into office was the same day that John Barron had committed suicide, January 9th, 1933. Even on the worst day of the Great Depression, October 29th, 1929, Hoosiers were full of optimism. A day earlier, October 28th, 1929, the South Bend Tribune had reported on the stock market crashing. But the next day, they reported on the stock market going back up, instead of worrying about the day previous. Even the day after that, they were still reported it going back up, and they commended the quickness in which it did. Although the worst day of the Depression was chillaxing in their living room, that didn't stop Hoosiers from looking on the bright side. Some Hoosiers decide not to let the depression get them down. Like today and the coronavirus pandemic, Hoosiers won't let themselves live in fear for something they cannot control. Throughout all the pitfalls of the Great Depression, Indiana had one person soothing them: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the November 30th, 1935 South Bend Tribune newspaper, one of the first page articles is that of FDR assuring the American people that the government will spend in necessity only. If you were a Hoosier during this time, it is probably calming to hear that the government will be responsible. This wouldn't be the only time FDR took the tone of responsibility in the South Bend Tribune. Our old friend, the January 11th, 1937 South Bend Tribune newspaper, had also reassuring actions by FDR. In the newspaper, FDR is asking for a $790 million relief from Congress. Seeing this in the newspaper must have been reassuring to some Hoosiers on the situation at large. To summarize, what Hoosiers did during the Great Depression was they didn't allow it to dictate their lives. Sure, it did for some, but for the majority, they just lived their lives, looking for the bright side in everything.